They called the dead zone for a reason. No pilot had ever made it in and out alive once enemy eyes locked on to their aircraft. It was a place where the mountains swallowed radio signals, where surface-to-air missiles waited like coiled snakes, and where the narrow strip of dirt they called a landing zone could barely fit a helicopter's shadow. The SEALs knew it. The command knew it. Every pilot in the room knew it. That's why when the order came, the room fell silent except for one voice. It didn't belong to a volunteer. It belonged to the man saying, "It can't be done." And then, from the back of the room, a chair scraped across the floor. A woman stood. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She didn't even look at anyone. She just picked up her flight helmet, walked toward the flight line, and climbed into the cockpit. No one knew her name, but in the next hour, the entire base and a team of SEALs clinging to a mission that had already been called impossible would never forget her. Welcome back to the Storyscape. Before we dive in, I have to ask, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments because your stories, your perspectives, they shape the way we tell ours. And if this is your first time here, this is the place where we bring you cinematic, high-stakes stories of courage, impossible odds, and the people who step forward when no one else can. The operations tent wasn't just warm, it was stifling. The smell of canvas baked in the sun, mixed with the tang of oil and dust carried in from the flight line. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of tired bodies, and the only constant sound was the quiet hum of the projector casting a pale blue glow across the front wall. On that wall, the map of the dead zone pulsed with red markers like an open wound. Steep mountains ringed a narrow valley, their slopes scarred by landslides and dotted with enemy positions. At the center was a flat strip barely big enough to land on, a patch of dirt the intelligence report labeled LZ Bravo. Colonel Harris stood beside the map, his hands clasped behind his back. His voice was calm, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut through the restless air. 2 hours ago, SEAL Team 7's extraction route was compromised. Their convoy was ambushed 5 clicks east of here. He tapped the map, the sound snapping everyone's focus to the blinking icon. They retreated to Bravo, but enemy units are closing in from 3 directions. 2 of our people are wounded. They won't hold much longer. He clicked the remote, and the image changed, now showing arcs of fire stretching across the valley. These are your problems. Shoulder-fired SAMs here, here, and here. Radar-guided AA guns embedded along this ridge.
Fly in too high, you light up their scopes. You come in low, you're inside small arms range before you can blink. Add to that, another click, this weather cell moving across the North Ridge. Winds at 70 knots. Visibility, 20 meters at best. A murmur rippled through the room. It wasn't surprise, it was recognition. Everyone here had heard stories about the dead zone. None of them ended well. Captain Owens, seated in the second row, leaned back with a shake of his head. With that kind of coverage, even a stealth approach won't get you in, not without losing the bird. Harris's gaze swept the room. We need a pilot who can get in, touch down at Bravo, load up the SEALs, and get them out. One shot, no do-overs. The room went still. The silence wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. Every pilot in here knew the risks, knew the math. No one wanted to be the first to say it, but the conclusion was already written on their faces. It can't be done. From the back row, she sat quietly, helmet resting by her boot. Her flight suit was worn soft, the stitching at the elbows frayed, the name patch faded to a ghost of its original lettering. She didn't shift in her chair, didn't lean forward to see the map. Her eyes were already locked on it, memorizing every line of terrain, without moving a muscle. Most in the room barely knew her. Some thought she'd transferred in from another base for routine transport work. Others assumed she was just a ferry pilot, someone who moved aircraft between units. She didn't drink with them in the mess, didn't join their card games, didn't share war stories. She was there, but never with them. Harris asked again, voice harder now, "Who's stepping up?" No one moved. Lieutenant Price finally broke the silence. "Sir, I'm not saying it's impossible, but with respect, it's suicide." The colonel's jaw tightened. Understood. His tone made it clear the conversation was over. If no one volunteered, he'd be forced to call command and deliver the news that a SEAL team would be left to die. And that was when it happened. A single sound broke the stillness, the metallic scrape of chair legs against concrete. Heads turned. She stood, calm and deliberate. No speeches, no bravado. She bent down, picked up her helmet, and slid her fingers over the chin strap. With a practiced motion, she locked it into place and walked toward the aisle. Price frowned. "Wait, you're not—" She didn't even glance at him. The pilots tracked her with their eyes as she passed, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief. She pushed through the tent flap, and sunlight poured in, blinding those nearest to the exit for a moment before the canvas swung shut. Outside, the tarmac shimmered under the afternoon heat. The flight line was alive with motion, mechanics shouting to one another, tools clanging, ground crew moving fuel hoses across the concrete. She walked with purpose, boots striking the ground in steady rhythm, eyes fixed on the farthest hangar. Inside the tent, a low hum began to rise, distant at first, then swelling into the deep, unmistakable growl of twin turbofans spinning up. The hangar doors rolled open to reveal a combat-worn warplane, its skin patched in places, its nose adorned with the faded paint of a shark's mouth. She guided the bird out onto the strip, canopy closed, visor down. The sunlight flared against the glass, hiding her expression from view. She held it idle, letting the engine settle into a steady roar. In the tent, Owens leaned toward a fellow pilot. "Who is she?" The older man shook his head slowly. "No idea, but if she's going where I think she's going, we're about to find out." The aircraft rolled to a stop at the hold-short line, engines breathing steady. Ground crew jogged alongside with last-minute checks, palms up, waiting for any sign. She gave them none. A glove tapped the throttle quadrant once, then settled. On the radio, the tower's voice cut through the static, calm, professional, unaware of the argument that had just played out in the briefing tent. "Raven 1, winds 210 at 8. You are cleared for immediate departure." She clicked the mic. One word. Copy. The bird surged forward. Tires hummed, then howled, then lifted clean. The runway fell away in a rush of light and heat, and the base shrank to an ordered grid behind her. She kept the climb shallow, nose just above the horizon, holding airspeed high. The mountains ahead were a jagged wall, dark ridgelines stacked like teeth. Somewhere past them, the dead zone waited. At 500 feet AGL, she leveled, then pushed over into a low, fast run. The altimeter numbers ticked down and steadied. Terrain became a blur, a smear of scrub, rock, and dry riverbeds sliding beneath the wings. Every movement was small, precise. Hands barely moved. The jet obeyed. Ops came online with clipped urgency. "Raven 1, be advised, we're seeing movement near the South Ridge. Possible man pads. Recommend east approach." She didn't answer. The nose drifted 2 degrees right, just enough to bend the line toward a winding canyon that threaded into the heart of the valley. The route had been drawn on the map like a warning. Too tight, too turbulent, too easy to trap an aircraft inside. It was also shadowed from the enemy's main radar arc. She chose shadow. On a separate channel, the SEAL team's comms broke through, compressed, rough, breath carried over gunfire. "Viper to base. We are green but shrinking." 1 KIA in pursuit element, 2 WIA holding. "We can hold 60 more if the east slope doesn't fold. Say status on ride." Base answered with what they had. "Wheels up.
En route. No names, no promises. Only time. She checked the chrono. 82 minutes to the hard cutoff. The canyon rose to meet her. Wind sheared along the rock, buffeting the wings. She rode it without fighting, letting the jet breathe with the terrain. A steep bend flashed ahead. She carved into it, banking low enough to taste rock dust in the air intakes. The heads-up display threw numbers across her visor, angles and warnings hunting for attention. She ignored everything that wasn't the line. Raven 1, Ops, insisted. She pressed the transmit switch once. Continuing. On an auxiliary panel, a small LED glowed, countermeasures hot. She thumbed the safety off and left it there. Flares and chaff, set to rip if the aircraft felt heat. Not drama, insurance. She slipped under a saddle ridge and into a broader bowl of land, and the world opened just enough to get dangerous. The radar warning receiver chirped. There, a prickle on the spine, a ground-based array testing the air. She dropped a touch lower, dragged the jet across the crumbly edge of the bowl, and let the ridge mask her. The chirp faded. Still breathing. In the tent far behind her, the pilots had drifted back to their seats, drawn to the dark shape on the moving map. Someone had plugged the aircraft feed into the main screen. A white icon traced a line that hugged the terrain so closely it looked hand-drawn. No one talked. Even the ones who'd said it can't be done watched like believers waiting for a sign. Raven 1, Ops, again. Storm cell is punching over the north wall ahead of you. Gusts reported severe. Recommend southern bypass. A southern bypass meant exposure, clean radar picture, more time in the open, more eyes staring up. She cut power a fraction, rolled left, and slid into the wind's shoulder instead. The first gust shoved the jet hard. She leaned into it and rode the shove into a controlled slip, then corrected as the air steadied. Instruments jittered. The horizon line wavered and returned. She flew through the violence like a needle colliding with cloth, puncturing, not tearing. On the SEAL channel, a voice none of them wanted to hear came on. The SEAL leader, breath calm enough to make the words colder. Enemy probing our south wire. Mortars walking closer. We can hold until 07, then we move or bleed. Tell the pilot we'll be at Bravo when the dust kicks. Ops tried to patch through. Raven, SEAL leader says, I heard, she said. She nudged the weapons systems page up for a heartbeat. Nothing there mattered today. This was a landing mission, not a strike.
The only ordnance that counted was courage and control, and both had to be spent precisely. The canyon narrowed again. The walls pressed close enough that the cockpit filled with a textured shadow. She could feel the ground in her hands through the stick, in her heels through the pedals. Ever so slightly she trimmed nose down to keep speed on the edge of useful and aggressive. A stone ridge shot past at canopy height. Flares of sunlight blinked through gaps like strobes. The radar warning receiver sang louder, different tone, faster. Not a search beam, a lock. Heat crawled along the skin of the jet. Missile! Ops snapped in her ear. She didn't answer. Her left hand rippled over the panel. Flares punched out the tail in rapid sequence, each dropping and burning hard, bright ghosts dragging heat away. Her right hand flattened the jet into the tightest profile it could manage while still moving. She kicked a touch of rudder, painted a small S in the air, and let the canyon's lip swallow the line of sight. The tone cut off mid-scream. The sky stayed clean. Back in the tent, someone exhaled a curse that sounded like a prayer. Colonel Harris didn't move. His eyes were locked on the icon and the little red arcs that kept trying to touch it and couldn't. Another bend, another slip of wind that wanted to throw the jet against the far wall. She rode that, too. The storm's leading edge broke across the canyon like torn fabric, gusts switching direction without warning. The aircraft trembled, then settled, trembled again. She breathed with it, measured, steady, letting seconds flow past at a rate she could control. She checked fuel, enough for the in and the out,
barely enough for a second try if the landing strip at Bravo turned into a trap. There wouldn't be a second try. She confirmed it to herself not with words, but with the way her hand stayed light on the throttle. Raven, you are 2 minutes to outer marker. Be advised, multiple thermal signatures near LZ Bravo, unknown if decoys or bodies. The team lead broke in, voice closer now. We'll pop smoke on your call. Wind is cross from the west. We can hold the slope for 90 seconds, then we are mobile whether you are here or not. She finally said the only thing she needed from them. When I say run, you run. The canyon spilled into the wide mouth of the valley, and the first true picture of the dead zone snapped into view. Brown earth torn up by old impacts, a few skeletal trees, a strip of lighter dirt, too small to be a runway, too straight to be natural. Bravo. Between her and that strip, heat signatures clustered like beads, some moving, some still, some flickering with the unmistakable twitch of a gunner shifting position.
On the far slope, a truck sat half-hidden beneath the camo net. The jet's nose climbed a whisper and then tipped back down. Her version of a nod. She saw it. She accepted it. The radio crackled with channels stacking over each other. Ops called winds, the team called smoke. Somewhere in the mess, another radar tone tried to claw its way into her attention and failed. She narrowed the world to 3 things: angle, distance, escape. She skimmed the valley floor, then let the terrain rise beneath her into a shallow right-hand turn that set the aircraft on a long descending arc toward the strip. It was not a standard pattern. It was a thread, drawn by a hand that refused to shake. Raven, you're hot on approach. Say call. Her voice came calm, level, final. On final. At the LZ, the first smoke popped, green. Then another can blooming into a thicker cloud, dragged sideways by the crosswind. Figures moved in and out of it, low and fast. The strip itself looked shorter with every heartbeat. A crosswind would try to pry the aircraft off the centerline the moment wheels kissed dirt. She dialed in a sliver of rudder trim, added a breath of power to keep the sink clean, and let the nose drift windward a hair so the fuselage would be straight at touchdown. On the team channel, someone said, "She's here." In the tent, silence pooled again, different from the first. No one was waiting for a volunteer anymore. They were waiting for gravity to answer a question about will. "Raven," Ops said, voice forced steady. "You are cleared to land Bravo." She didn't reply. The altimeter unwound. The ground rose. The smoke bent in the wind like a living thing trying to point the way. Her hand stayed light. Her breathing never changed. The aircraft crossed the threshold. If the strip had a threshold, it was a suggestion in dirt, and began to settle. When she finally spoke, it was to the men on the ground, timed to the heartbeat between flying and rolling. Run. The instant her wheels hit dirt, the valley came alive. The impact wasn't graceful, it was raw, the suspension groaning as the jet absorbed the shock of landing on a surface that had never been meant for it. Dust exploded outward, swallowing the aircraft in a gritty haze. The crosswind tried to shove her sideways, but she corrected with a sharp boot of rudder, keeping the nose aligned down the strip. "Ravens on deck," Ops announced into the network, but the call was almost drowned out by the chaos unfolding on the ground. From the tree line, the first bursts of enemy fire stitched across the dirt, sparking against the jet's armored fuselage. She didn't flinch. One hand stayed tight on the throttles, the other working the control surfaces to keep the roll perfectly straight.
At 60 knots, she hauled back on the power levers, braking hard. The nose dipped, the tail shuddered, and the world seemed to shrink to a narrow tunnel ahead. Through the dust, dark shapes broke into the open, seals, low and fast, carrying wounded between them. Their gear was covered in mud, their movements sharp with the precision of men who'd rehearsed for every nightmare scenario except this one. Green smoke swirled around them in long streamers, clinging to the hot air before the wind carried it away. 30 seconds, she said over the team channel, her voice steady and unhurried. The first man reached the ladder on the starboard side, hauling himself up with one hand while the other gripped the rifle slung across his chest. A second figure followed, shoving a wounded teammate up to waiting hands inside the troop bay. Enemy tracers cut through the dust like red-hot needles. One zipped past her canopy close enough to leave a faint scorch mark. Her eyes never left the instruments: airspeed, brake temp, throttle position. Behind her, the last of the SEALs appeared from the tree line, two of them carrying a man with his arm bound tight against his chest. They moved in bursts, crouching low between sprints. A mortar round whistled overhead and impacted near the far end of the strip, throwing a curtain of dirt into the air. Ops was in her ear. "Raven, you've got armor moving from the North Road, 90 seconds to visual." Her reply was immediate. "We'll be gone in 30. She watched in her peripheral vision as the final team members scrambled aboard, slamming the hatch shut behind them. The green smoke was already thinning, revealing the scarred earth and the black shapes of advancing enemy fighters in the distance. Throttle forward, slow at first, then a hard push. The engines howled, turbines spooling to maximum. The aircraft surged ahead, shaking loose the dust clinging to its skin. She kept the nose pinned low until the end of the strip, then pulled back with just enough authority to break free of the ground. The moment she climbed, the valley's defenses woke up. Radar alarms screamed in her headset. The threat receiver lit up with signals, multiple locks, multiple directions. She rolled hard right, then snapped left, forcing the enemy gunners to chase a moving target. "Countermeasures," she called to herself more than anyone else, punching out flares in quick bursts. Each one bloomed bright against the midday sky, falling away as the aircraft banked toward the narrow exit canyon. Inside the troop bay, the SEALs were silent, except for the labored breathing of the wounded. One of them leaned against the bulkhead, watching her work through the open cockpit door.
Even in the chaos, there was something unsettling about the way she flew. Every movement was precise, deliberate, as if she'd done this 100 times before in places just as bad or worse. The canyon walls loomed ahead, a jagged gateway back to safety. She dropped low again, hugging the terrain so tight the wingtips seemed to scrape the rock. The enemy fire slackened as they lost sight of her, the echoes of the battle fading into the roar of the engines. Only when the radar scope cleared and the warning tones died did she allow herself a single deep breath. Not relief, just recalibration. In the back, the SEAL team leader keyed his mic. "Raven, whoever you are, you just saved 12 men." She didn't respond. Her eyes stayed forward, on the thin blue horizon line that meant home was still a long way away. The mission wasn't over until her wheels were back on base, and until then, the dead zone still had one last chance to keep what was theirs. For the first 5 minutes after leaving the dead zone, nothing moved on the radar but the line of the canyon. It was the quiet that always came before the bad part, a stillness pilots learned to distrust. She kept the aircraft low, riding the folds of terrain as if she'd memorized them in another lifetime. Inside the troop bay, the SEALs were busy tending to the wounded. One of the medics was kneeling over a man with a tourniquet cinched tight around his leg, murmuring instructions as he worked. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, cordite, and hydraulic fluid. No one asked the pilot's name. Not yet. Ops came online in her headset. "Raven 1, be advised, Recon Bird reports multiple fast movers inbound from the north, likely MiGs. You've got 8 minutes before they're in missile range." She adjusted her course 2 degrees west without a word, threading the jet between 2 ridges that rose like stone battlements. The shadows swallowed the aircraft from the sky above. In the bay, the team leader, broad-shouldered, eyes like they'd seen every bad thing twice, moved up to the cockpit door. He didn't step in, just leaned an arm against the frame. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question.
Her eyes stayed on the altimeter. Sit down, strap in. He smirked faintly but didn't push. Instead, he caught a glimpse of something on her left forearm when she reached for a switch. Dark ink under the cuff of her glove. Not a unit tattoo he recognized, but close. The kind only certain people earned in places no map showed. He decided not to ask. The aircraft jolted as a crosswind slammed into it. She corrected instantly, riding the gust out without bleeding speed. The leader noticed. No wasted motion, no panic, no hesitation. Whoever she was, she'd flown combat profiles before, and not the easy ones.
Ops again. Raven, enemy interceptors are breaking south. They'll have you on scope in 3 minutes unless you mask. She was already dropping the nose, letting the ridge line ahead rise above them like a closing door. The G-forces pulled at every muscle as she banked left into a narrow side canyon, its floor barely wide enough for the wingspan. The altimeter unwound, 200 feet, then 150. In the bay, a SEAL cursed under his breath. "We're gonna clip a wing." "No," the leader said quietly, almost to himself. "We're not." The canyon spilled them out into a wide basin ringed with broken hills. She used the terrain like a living thing, sliding behind every fold and outcrop to keep the radar picture muddy. Behind her, the MiG streaked past the main canyon mouth, overshooting their prey without realizing it. Ops called in, relief creeping into his voice. "Looks like you've shaken the interceptors. No radar returns in your sector." But she didn't relax. She'd been out long enough to know that the first threat was rarely the last. Sure enough, a new tone whispered in her headset. Lower, slower. A search beam, ground-based, sweeping lazily across the basin. Instead of running from it, she angled toward a thin pass in the west wall, pouring on power. The jet knifed through the gap, rock blurring past the wingtips. The search beam faded, replaced by the safe, empty hiss of static. The leader was still at the cockpit door. "Who trained you?" She didn't answer. The look she gave him wasn't hostile, but it carried weight, a silent warning that some questions would never get answers. He understood. In his world, the best operators were ghosts. She was one of them. The radio crackled again, this time with friendlier traffic. "Raven 1, you are cleared to egress via Corridor Delta. Weather ahead is stable. We've got your recovery window." She keyed the mic. "Copy Delta, 2 minutes to break." As the ridges thinned and the open desert began to stretch ahead, the leader finally stepped back into the bay. He said nothing to the others about what he'd seen, but he knew they'd all noticed the same thing. This wasn't just a pilot. This was someone who'd been built for missions exactly like this, the kind you didn't read about and the kind that didn't forgive mistakes. Up front, she eased the nose up and let the jet climb, the altimeter spinning higher until the horizon flattened out in every direction. The worst of the gauntlet was behind them, but she flew like the fight wasn't over, because in her experience, it never really was. Somewhere behind them, the dead zone shrank into a smudge on the map. Somewhere ahead, the runway back at base was waiting. But in the middle of that distance, there was still time for everything to go wrong, and she'd be ready when it did. The first sign of the base came as a thin silver thread on the horizon, runway lights shimmering in the late-day heat. To the men in the back, it was a promise. To her, it was just another piece of the checklist. The mission wasn't over until the wheels stopped turning. Ops came online. "Raven 1, you are cleared for straight-in approach, runway 21. Winds 5 knots from the west. Welcome home." She didn't reply. The jet's nose dipped slightly, trading altitude for speed as the airstrip grew larger in the canopy. Her eyes moved in small, precise scans, airspeed, engine temps, hydraulic pressure, brake pressure, never lingering on one gauge too long. In the troop bay, the SEALs began to relax for the first time. Helmets were unbuckled, rifles slung to the side. The medic checked his tourniquet one last time, giving a curt nod. The team leader, still standing near the bulkhead, watched the pilot in silence. Every movement she made reinforced what he'd suspected since the first minute. She'd done this kind of flying in the worst places imaginable. 2 minutes to wheels down, Ops said. Copy, she answered, her voice low and even. The aircraft crossed the perimeter fence, the runway racing up to meet it. The touchdown was firm but controlled, the tires screaming for a heartbeat before the nose gear settled. She rolled out straight, bringing the throttles back to idle, letting the momentum bleed off naturally before applying brakes. The SEALs glanced at each other. No more radar tones, no more gunfire, no more banking turns that threatened to shake the fillings out of their teeth. Just the steady deceleration of something finally, definitively over. They cleared the runway and taxied toward the far end of the apron, away from the main hangars. A pair of ground crew waved them in, guiding the bird into a shadowed corner of the tarmac. The engines wound down with a deep, slow sigh, the sound echoing off the nearby walls. The hatch dropped, and warm air flooded the bay. The SEALs filed out one by one, boots hitting the concrete with dull thuds. Some limped, some carried stretchers, but all of them were alive. The team leader was the last to step out. He paused at the base of the ladder and looked back up into the cockpit. She was still strapped in, helmet on, visor down. For a second, he thought about asking her name again. Instead, he just gave a small nod. She didn't return it, didn't have to. The engines were quiet now, but in the space between them, her silence spoke louder than anything else. He walked toward the waiting medics, where Colonel Harris was already debriefing the team.
The colonel's eyes flicked to the parked jet, and for a moment his expression softened. Recognition mixed with something else. Respect, maybe. One of the younger SEALs asked under his breath, "Sir, who was that?" Harris didn't look at him when he answered, "The reason you're still breathing." Back in the cockpit, she powered down the last of the systems, the panels going dark one by one. The reflection in the canopy caught a sliver of her forearm as she pulled her gloves off, the same ink the team leader had noticed earlier, a mark from a unit that officially didn't exist. She climbed down from the jet, walked past the group without a glance, and disappeared into the maze of hangars. By the time anyone thought to follow, she was gone. The dead zone had taken lives before, but today it had given up 12 men without a word. The debriefing room at the far end of the base was a mix of adrenaline and exhaustion. The SEAL team sat scattered across metal chairs, uniforms streaked with dust and sweat, their rifles stacked against the wall. Medics moved among them, tending to wounds, checking vitals, and handing out water bottles that dripped condensation onto the floor. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and antiseptic, the sharp tang of survival. Colonel Harris stood at the head of the room, clipboard in hand, firing off questions in his usual clipped manner. Enemy composition, estimated numbers. The answers came back in short bursts, professional, precise, stripped of any emotion. But beneath the surface, the truth was there. They knew they'd come within minutes of not making it out at all. The team leader sat forward, elbows on his knees, answering each question without flourish. When Harris asked about the extraction, there was a moment's pause before he replied. The landing was impossible, until it wasn't. That earned a brief glance from Harris, but the colonel said nothing, simply scribbling notes. Pilot name. The leader shook his head. She didn't say. Harris's pen froze mid-word. There was the faintest flicker in his expression, but it was gone before anyone else could read it. Then you don't need to know, he said finally, moving on to the next question. In the hangar outside, the jet sat alone, its paint dulled by years of service, dust still clinging to the wheel wells. It looked like any other bird on the line to those who didn't know what it had just done. Ground crew were already crawling over it, checking for damage.
They'd find scuffs, burn marks, maybe a few small holes, nothing that would explain how it had survived what it had flown through. Across the tarmac, away from the bustle, she walked in silence toward the smaller auxiliary hangars near the perimeter fence.
Helmet in one hand, gloves in the other, the wind tugging lightly at her flight suit. No one stopped her. No one called out. A few crew members glanced up, recognition flickering in their eyes, but they didn't speak. They knew better. She reached a side door, swiped a card across a reader with no visible unit insignia, and stepped inside. The door closed behind her, sealing her away from the questions that would never be answered. Back in the debriefing room, the team leader leaned back in his chair, replaying the flight in his mind. The sound of engines roaring against the wind, the violent sway of the aircraft in the canyon, the split-second drop of flares when the missile warning screamed. He'd flown with good pilots before. He'd flown with great ones. But what he saw today was something else entirely. Something that didn't happen by accident. One of his men nudged him. Seriously, who was she? The leader took a long breath, then gave the only answer that fit. The reason we're still breathing. That drew a short, quiet laugh from another SEAL. Guess she doesn't care about thanks. Guess she doesn't need them, the leader replied. His gaze drifted toward the hangar doors, but there was nothing to see now. Just the faint glint of sunlight on the canopy of a jet, parked alone, waiting for its next mission. Later that night, under the low hum of the base's sodium lights, the jet was moved into a corner of the maintenance hangar. A single tarp was thrown over it, not to hide it, but to mark it as unavailable. On the far side of the airfield, a small unmarked office light glowed for a few minutes, then went dark. No one saw her leave. No one knew where she went. Somewhere in the base archives there might have been a record, a flight log, a name, a serial number. But if it existed, it was buried deep enough that only a handful of people would ever see it. The kind of people who understood that some missions were meant to be remembered, but not spoken of. The SEAL team left 2 days later, their transport lifting off into the dawn. As the ramp closed, the leader took one last look across the runway. He thought, just for a second, he saw a figure in a flight suit at the edge of the hangars, watching. But when he blinked, there was nothing there. Back in the dead zone, the smoke had cleared, and the enemy had reclaimed the strip. They would never know how close they had come to keeping 12 men forever. They would never know who had slipped in and out beneath their guns. And the only person who could tell them, she was already somewhere else, helmet under her arm, eyes on another horizon, waiting for the next time someone said, "It can't be done." And, as always, she would answer without a word.